Before we begin, I want to ask a question to all the men in the audience. It is a very simple question, and that is, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Now, obviously, it's become a meme recently on how men enjoy thinking about the Roman Empire, and it's of no shock to me either. The influence the empire's had on modern society and culture is still apparent and cannot be overstated. One of, if not, the most relevant government in human history. Yet it feels so distant. I guess being near 20 lifetimes removed will do that, but it does add a sort of mystical quality. Regardless, the Roman Empire still lives on as an echo through religion, architecture, and culture, which continues to inspire both historical retellings and fantastical fictional tales. Truly an era that tickles the imagination, and is blatantly the inspiration for today's video subject, and that is Adastra. Now, before I actually talk about the game, I do need to preface this video with a few points, and that'll be in relation to the content itself. I will be blunt, and that does have a few pornographic moments, in which I'll obviously not show, but are a not so small, but important part of the big picture. That, and of course, it falls into the gay furry variety as well. All of this was probably as subtle as the kick to the nuts, but allow me to give my disclaimers. I am also not a historian, but I'll be sure to be as accurate as I can, without shilling out some cash. Adastra is a forbidden love romance tale between two young men set upon a fictional moon of the same name. Aesthetically, it pulls heavily from the Roman Empire, but as we dig further, there are other parallels to be made in how they tie into Rome thematically. While taking inspiration from such a long-standing and widespread government, the story itself takes place predominantly in a very narrow and isolated location. That is, within the royal palace on Adastra. The reason being is the backdrop of the narrative itself, which is one of conflict between two brothers over the throne after the sudden death of their father, the emperor. The story is from the perspective of a seemingly random human who gets whisked away against his will to get entangled in the incredibly turbulent political drama of a race of anthropomorphic wolf people. Saying all of this out loud makes me sound unhinged to varying degrees, but I really do like this setup. Being the foreign fish out of water integrates exposition naturally within the plot, even though it can be delivered with an aura of condescension. Allow me to explain. As I said earlier, we experience the narrative from the perspective of a normal human man. Canonically, his name is Marco, but you can name him whatever you want, even after yourself, if you are into those spicy roleplay situations. For the sake of brevity, I'll refer to him as Marco throughout this video. Well, during his trip to study abroad in Italy, he gets abducted by an alien named Amicus, to be his pet. Remember, this game is fetish pornography after all. But yeah, the whole pet thing is why exposition can be delivered through pontification. You see, there are essentially four classes of people in this story's universe: the parents, siblings, children, and uncontacted. The parents are an incredibly advanced super race who took it upon themselves to spread their wisdom and knowledge to everyone else, starting with the most advanced civilizations they could find beneath them. They get referred to as the siblings, and Adastra is a culture that falls under this classification. Now, I cannot stress enough how even though the sibling races are just one step below the parents, that one step is gargantuan, and they even revere the parents as benevolent deities. Back to the siblings though, their whole role is to uplift less advanced civilizations, which means to culturally and technologically guide them in hopes of them becoming equals, while also striving to improve themselves in hopes of some sort of ascension. The civilizations they work to improve are referred to as the children, and through a series of misunderstandings, Amicus believes Marco, and humans in general, to be a child race uplifted by the Adastrans, which is why he initially talks down to our protagonist. In reality though, humanity falls under the classification of uncontacted, groups that either just haven't been chosen to uplift yet, or worse, were abandoned for either being too dumb or violent. And apparently, making contact without permission is very, very illegal. It gets mentioned, in a rather offhanded manner, that abandoned civilizations are essentially uncontacted, so hence why it's lumped together. Anyway, this setup also shrinks the general setting in which the narrative takes its course. The vast majority of it is spent within the palace walls, where all the political conflicts take place. There is this broad scope to everything, from whatever mysterious endgame the parents have planned, to the varying cultures you get limited viewings of. But what keeps Marco, and by proxy us, in the dark is that we are essentially tied to one central location, disconnecting us from the wider world. This radically limits the context we have, especially early on, and a part of the fun of the whole experience is watching everything unravel. There's this natural ebb and flow to the central conflicts, creating a genuine roller coaster-like feeling. I don't think any story has made me go from "it's so over" to "we're so back" in such a consistent and powerful way, which is only compounded by the fact Marco is essentially trapped in the central location. No matter what happens, good or bad, he has to quite literally live with it. It is rather tense to say the least, but what cuts through this tension is Amicus himself. I can boil down why to a very simple point. Amicus is so charming and likable that any and all stresses melt away when he is around, which is why his position is a powerful tool the story implements. Marco, essentially being a foreign slave, has no knowledge, power, or status to speak of. But later in the plot, when Amicus is removed from the story temporarily, Marco needs to step up and claim some agency for himself, because throughout the story up to that point, he has none. Which sounds bad, and it is. But on the flip side, it's only like this because Amicus has such a kind soul. Amicus is in direct line to the throne of Adastra, and when I think of a character in that kind of position, I imagine a very unlikable, spoiled brat kind of character, when instead, he is a very likable, spoiled brat kind of character. He oozes good intentions, but mix that up with coddled naivete and poor foresight, he tends to get in over his head in most situations. He also, in general, has a lot of self-centered habits like poor communication skills, and the tendency to make decisions involving Marco without consulting him. For a love interest character, I really do enjoy how these flaws manifest, because of course Amicus isn't malicious or ill-meaning, but he is very childish and short-sighted, which does cause conflict between both main characters pretty much up until the end of the story. Lovers' quarrels, if you will. Well, it ends up becoming lovers' quarrels, since of course there needs to be a slow burn for romantic affection to bloom, while also feeling genuine. An uphill battle for sure, since the setup obviously demands great care in the writing department for it not to devolve into a creepy Stockholm Syndrome situation type deal. Honestly though, what makes the whole game work is Amicus himself. He is the solid foundation to the entire experience, and seeing him cry genuinely broke my heart and ruined my day. But yeah, the story wouldn't even be half as enjoyable if Amicus wasn't as pleasant as he is, which also means he's the make it or break it factor. If you don't like him, you probably won't like the game overall, and liking him also hinges on you being in the niche audience that would be into that sort of thing, you know? But regardless, the main conflict is all about him becoming emperor, whether or not he's capable or the best person for it. Early on, he does give off the feeling of naivete and childishness, but over the course of the story, you see him come into his own and mature as a person. And Marco helps with that. It is a positive feedback loop between the both of them, where even at their worst, they still build each other up. Not entirely flawless, since Marco is equally as childish and a tad hot-headed, but that level of realism between both of them I appreciate. And it only makes the sweet moments sweeter, in my opinion. The attitude Amicus has overall creates an interesting juxtaposition with his brother Cassius though. After their father's death, Cassius challenges Amicus's right to the throne, and at the start of the story it does make him seem kinda terrible, only made worse by him being a more accurate depiction of the prejudice one would find among the Adastran population, and expresses that in ways that took me by surprise. Okay, look, let's just say I was not expecting to read a real-world slur in this game. But it definitely was used in a way that really drove home the point. This part is actually really interesting for his character and encapsulates his identity perfectly. He too has a pet slave. I mean, obviously that's kind of the point Marco's even brought there to begin with, but anyway. It is heavily implied, and I mean heavily implied, that Cassius and his pet Alexios are romantically entangled, even though that'd be hella gay. This relationship is obviously kept on the DL, which gives us the most poignant insight into his character, in that he's willing to sacrifice his own comfort to become emperor, and in doing so, achieves what he believes is correct and just. Now, comparing this to the real Roman Empire gives us an interesting perspective. The role that Marco and Alexios play in these relationships is a direct nod to the real equivalent, but in reality, things were a tad more complicated. It seems in Adastra all forms of homosexuality are frowned upon wholesale, while in Rome it was tied to social class. To put it bluntly, bottoms were second-class citizens. So Marco and Alexios being in these agreements mirrors the boy-slave part within Rome itself. But the idea was that homosexuality was generally considered okay if one was not stripping a full citizen of his masculinity. So these legal relationships had a historical, social power imbalance to them, and Adastra, as a story, captures this imbalance and depicts it most strongly when interacting with Cassius. Like when he suggests Amicus beat Marco as punishment for spilling his wine. It's supposed to give off this feeling that Cassius is a threat even though he is physically frail. You see, he suffers from what looks to be a hereditary degenerative bone condition. This condition he shares with their late mother, and obviously his weakness is effectively an affront to his masculinity. Regardless, this circumstance paints his political ideology and what he wants to focus on as a leader, which would be inward toward the people of Adastra. Amicus, as emperor, wants to reconnect with the other siblings and foster stronger bonds with them, while Cassius believes the empire has been neglecting its own people and wants to improve their lot in life, which makes this conflict between both of them not entirely black and white. Either of them would be a reasonable choice for emperor. The issue is they aren't the only people with a vested interest in who takes the throne. It's all very complicated by nature, which does remind me of a point that I personally think is interesting in regards to both brothers. To start with Cassius, do you remember reading in school about the assassination of Julius Caesar? I'm sure some of you do, at least. Well, one of the main conspirators of said assassination was named Gaius Cassius Longinus, and I don't think that's a coincidence. But there is a key factor that truly fascinates me, and is shared among most characters in this game, and that is there's some level of antithesis to their naming scheme, if that makes any sense. Here, I'll elaborate with Cassius. His real-world counterpart differs in a very key ideological outlook. From what I gather, he was very against the idea of despots, which is a ruler with complete and total power. In the game, Cassius as emperor wants to strip away the power of the triumvirates, a group that can easily vote against what the emperor wants, which would give him complete and total power. His reasoning would be that he's confident he can make Adastra flourish without them, and they only hinder his progress in that regard. This goes back into my statement about antithesis, and this stretches to Amicus as well, but in a more speculative kind of way. When I mentioned the assassination of Julius Caesar, the name that probably came to mind was Brutus. Well, I'm just saying that Brutus was the brother-in-law to the real Cassius. Let's get a little etymological for a second. Let's just keep that. You can't expect me to pronounce that without fucking up, right? Here, you see the origin of the word brute comes from the Latin brutus. And when we inverse the meaning of the word, we can stretch it to the Latin word amicus, where we derive our word amicable. Doubly more interesting since the word brute is heavily associated with animalistic savagery, while we're dealing with anthropomorphic wolf aliens. Tons of that aforementioned antithesis going on. And going forward, I'll continue to elaborate my idea with as many characters as I'm able to. Starting with the next character I want to discuss, Neferu. Neferu is the second son of the Pharaoh of Chemia, another sibling planet, and he's conveniently on Adastra as a diplomat during their turbulent political shenanigans. Him being Chemian also makes him a different race of anthro, based on jackals, which are a similar grouping of animals to wolves, so that checks out. He is initially really difficult to read, and is probably the most immediately suspicious character in the palace due to his more exaggerated and sultry nature. Over time, though, he becomes a good friend to Marco, and eventual co-conspirator in the latter half of the story. Like many aspects of the plot, his presence contributes to showing the player how Adastra views and interacts with other people. You experience how they look down upon the children, but with Neferu, you witness how they treat the other siblings similarly. Since you are so isolated in the plot, another outsider really is needed to drive home the point on how Adastra has a very tenuous relationship with every other group, which reinforces our desire for Amicus to beat out Cassius for the throne. And the overarching narrative feeds into that, with Neferu and Amicus forming their own deals through, specific means. Remember, the game is porn, okay? Regardless, this agreement between them serves as its own foreshadowing, in a weird way. But, digging into Neferu's name, we learn that it means beauty, as well as being a woman's name. Taking into account his design has the most fit and masculine build out of the entire cast, which serves to contrast his feminine name and behavior. The name is also Egyptian, which Chemia seems to be based on, and Egypt is for a potential future Chemia video. Okay? Now, Neferu was brought to the palace by the sister of Amicus and Cassius, and her name is Virginia. She is the eldest of the three, and shows that with being the most mature out of all of them. Honestly though, out of everyone in this story, she probably has the best head on her shoulders and is remarkably competent. She is straightforward and to the point, while being the best at playing the dumb game of politics. The story is also blunt in what she represents overall, which is the limited rights and positions of power women held in the time of ancient Rome. So there's this feminist angle to her character, which does a lot to balance out the sheer amounts of testosterone oozed by the entire rest of the cast. I feel kind of mixed here though. Like, the fact she's the most competent plays into the writing stereotype of men being dumb troglodytes that need to be wrangled by a woman, but I can also see that as the point overall that her competence is tragically overlooked, so I don't see anything wrong with her place in the narrative. I don't know, do lesbian visual novels have the one guy character to balance out their estrogen? It's that sort of thing. Nothing wrong with it, and it makes a more fleshed out world overall, so I guess it's more of a what are you looking to get out of the story sort of deal. It might be a bit of a stretch, but her name being Virginia betrays her role. A name that is associated with innocence being given to the most world-wise and independent of the trio's siblings, to the point within the story there's some speculation that she brought Neferu to the palace to intimidate the interim emperor, and that is Kato. See, after the Emperor died in a tragic accident, his royal advisor and longtime friend Kato took control until either Amicus or Cassius could. At least that's how it's initially billed, since after a while it's clear he's the true main antagonist of this whole ordeal. The reason why he would be bothered by Neferu's presence is that Kato was involved in the war between Adastra and Chemia, which is a really smart bit of manipulation overall. Kato is the only one old enough in the core cast to be alive during the war, thus holding an extra layer of prejudice, while also being in no sort of position to act out on it. Although you initially can't tell if it even bothers him, since Kato is very good at keeping his emotions under wraps for most of the plot. Most of it. He is also probably named after Kato the Younger, who wasn't a part of the Roman Empire, but instead the Roman Republic. Being named after a figure with a title invocative of youth, while simultaneously being the oldest of the entire cast, is a level of irony that isn't lost on me, while also being associated with a separate regime than the Roman Empire, while himself coming from a different, older Adastra with a slightly different set of values, is an interesting sort of bait and switch when his villainous intentions come to light. Now, I wish I was clever enough to naturally transition from talking about Kato to Alexios, but I'm not, so let's just start talking about the Catboy Twink Slave, okay? Alexios is interesting pretty much immediately since he's the only person in the game who is an equal to Marco, with both of them being pets, you know? His introduction lends into this first impression too, since he feels safe to be around. Everyone else feels larger than life, and you get this perception they all tower over you, except for Alexios, which ultimately makes his betrayal more sour. Like everyone else, he has an angle, and regardless of his own feelings for Cassius, he also has an obligation to his homeland of Amorpha. And speaking of all that, Amorpha is interesting since it seems to be inspired by ancient Greece, a fact that took me way too long to notice. Like, I only realized when they made a not-so-subtle statement that Adastra and Amorpha have similar cultures. Now I want you to all imagine the history buffs in your personal lives for a second. Okay, now imagine them getting into an argument about the Greeks and Romans. People can get pretty heated over this subject, so this whole nod to the shared cultural elements and identity between the two is really funny to me. Obviously, Alexios is a Greek name, and it means man's defender, which is really fucking goofy when you consider Alexios' whole character as one of treachery, deceit, and espionage. Tragically, the most down-to-earth of the cast is the one who has most to hide. Whew. Now that I've gone over all the characters and story that I want to discuss, I want to have things get a little off track for a bit. All this talk about cultures and politics, it's all fine and dandy, but have you ever wondered how they came to be? Let's use Rome and Egypt as examples. Major empires in their days, while being incredibly advanced for their times. With the story of Adastra, Earth plays an interesting part in the lore. In the game, Rome comes from Adastra, and not just that apparently, all the siblings tried to uplift humanity, and remnants of all their cultures are felt throughout history. That's why, unlike all these different groups, humans don't have a unified culture or government. There are some more esoteric theories out there that suggest ancient aliens may have been involved in cultivating more advanced societies here on Earth. So let's consult the experts in these thought processes for a minute. Now before I do, I should put a fun police disclaimer here saying obviously take everything in this section with a tablespoon of salt, since we are going beyond the boundaries of science and anthropology. Instead, we're digging into anthropology. The obvious sources for such prestigious information is usually held by the prodigious scholars at the History Channel, who bless us with their divine knowledge. Like here in the snippet about the Temple of Jupiter in Lebanon.
How ancient people carved and moved such massive stones is a question that baffles archaeologists to this day. And equally as mysterious is who placed them there.
Now tell me how all this makes sense.
It was a giant stone platform that spaceships could land on and take off from. And this makes a lot of sense.
You know, I don't know why I even doubted you. For another alien theory, have you ever heard of the crystal skulls? Those skulls made from quartz that are for sure 100% indisputably ancient, and the general consensus on them being a total mystery. You know, like in Indiana Jones and Persona 2. A fringe theory is that they were constructed by aliens, and Rome has their own artifact that has a background of similar speculation behind it, and that is the Roman dodecahedron. An admittedly really cool looking object with little documentation to its purpose. Obviously, if we don't have a concrete idea, it must be aliens. But now, in all seriousness for a second, I did find the small lecture, which I'll link below, in which he talks about UFO sightings throughout history, including Rome. Talks about flying shields and raining blood, and it's actually an informative video on how phenomena are described and depicted. Most notably on the point that to the everyman, we don't have the knowledge set to properly interpret what they're even communicating, which can lead to more fanciful theories like the video I showed earlier. On the flip side, these more fanciful interpretations are really entertaining, and that's probably why Ancient Aliens has 20 fucking seasons, Jesus Christ. But it makes interesting fiction, like with Adastra, which has the central part of its lore focus on this concept. Basically, a lot of life is just fun and games, and there's nothing wrong with indulgence from time to time. On the topic of indulgence though, I do want to pick at something about Adastra that didn't sit too well with me personally, and that's an aspect of its sexualization. Okay, remember when I said way earlier that this was a porn game? A furry porn game? A gay furry porn game? Well, now to briefly touch upon that old subject. When we think of romance visual novels in general, I know me and many others imagine a story that is like a tree. Starts in the same place, but with branching paths to whatever romance option your underdeveloped little heart desires. Adastra is way more linear than that, and the only love is for Amicus. Now don't get me wrong, Amicus is a darling, but being an anthro wolf comes with the territory of being slightly weirder. For me, some of the characteristics of Amicus and others were a little too close to beast rather than man. A good example would be when Marco gives Amicus belly rubs and it excites him. Stuff like that. It came off as really weird to me, but obviously I'm not truly inundated into the eccentricities of the rather wide furry community. I know the community does get lumped in with the sexual aspect wholesale, even though it isn't indicative of everyone, so this isn't a jab, but more an observation that pertains to this particular game. It was just noticeable enough for me to make a point and want to discuss. I do respect Echo Project for not watering down their vision and providing a non-explicit version of the game, even though it would broaden their audience. Stick to your guns, everyone. But yeah, this game is for a very, very specific kind of individual, but looking past this discomfort did allow me to really appreciate a stellar story. But going back to the sex stuff for a second, one thing I really found comical is the last choice you make in the game: top or bottom. I'm sure you can guess what that entails, but this decision holds more importance than you'd initially think. This choice exemplifies the most agency that us and Marco have in the events of the narrative. The only other time any decision leads to something meaningful is when you're asked to submit your freedom to the parents, which really is actually incredibly clever and plays into the human condition super well. As conscious beings, we most likely believe we have some degree of power and control over our destinies. Even religious people who believe in omnipotent and omniscient deities still hold on to the idea that we have free will. So when presented with a choice to give that up, of course the rational decision is not to. And through a series of events, Marco ends up getting killed by Kato, leading to the most heartbreaking scene in the whole game. Legitimately fucked me up for the rest of the night. Regardless, deciding for yourself that you want your freedom leads to the bad ending. By sacrificing your resolve and free will, the parents heal Marco, and you get a really long and sweet epilogue. This right here is the moral dilemma introduced by Adastra, more so than anything else. When presented with death and dissatisfaction while making a choice, is that truly free will? The parents seem to have a very specific way of coercing people, in that they manipulate happiness for whatever end goal they have. When we bring in deities beyond our comprehension into the fold, the idea of agency becomes significantly more muddled. And obviously, from a philosophical standpoint, this idea isn't new or anything, but it is still one that invokes existential dread nonetheless. It's scary, like genuinely so. See, in Adastra's universe, there's this nebulous, corruptive evil known as the Other, and the aim of the parents is to fight against it. And to do that, they put every gear in motion within the story to reach that goal. Marco needed to be in Adastra to make sure Amicus became Emperor, so Marco could return to Earth and connect humanity to the galaxies, which would contribute to their plan. By its very nature, Marco and even Amicus had zero power in anything here, and even though being together makes both of them happy, the experience is kind of soured, at least to me. Adastra ends on a weird emotional note, that both of them are separated for 8 years to assist in this endgame, and in the ending, everything sorta comes full circle. Amicus abducts Marco against his will, to then return Marco to the same place against his will. It is interestingly poignant and provides a decently satisfying conclusion, but it really does leave my heart wanting more. Seeing the apartment where the journey began felt so strange, like the normal apartment on Earth felt alien. And now I guess this is the place to end the video too. Adastra was a great story that was an intensely emotional roller coaster. I laughed, and I cried. It was something I'm not going to forget anytime soon, and I cannot wait for the sequel and side game to be finished, just so I can see more of these characters, especially Amicus. The note I want to leave you on, though, is this. How often will you think about the Roman Empire?